Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to History 1302, Westward Expansion, Part 3 of 3. Just very briefly on this slide, it's a slide you've seen at least twice, maybe three times, I don't know, before. Our thesis statement is the Turner Thesis, also known as the Frontier Thesis. Westward Expansion was a major event in American history. It happened only in America. We get a definition out of this. The frontier is where wilderness meets civilization. And the frontier closes in 1890, an artificial date based on the census of 1890. The next thing that we talked about, which we only got done with on presentation 2 of 2, is Native American tribes in the West. And their situation is really terrible. We went over that in excruciating detail. About 2 million of them west of the Mississippi, and we have to deal with them. We finished that off with the Dawes Severalty Act, 1887. The date is part of the name, so don't forget it. We also talked in presentation 2 of 2, motives for moving west in the post-Civil War era, and that is gold, the Homestead Act of 1862. Sorry, I had a little hesitation there. The Homestead Act of 1862. Itchy feet. There's like lots of reasons to go to the west. Escape. That's going to be a big one. What we're going to do now is finish up here in part 3 with people that move west. I have some image analysis we're going to go through. And then how people get to the west, the pros and cons. Then we'll talk about, I'll have a slide that we're going to spend maybe 20 minutes or half an hour on. Frederick Jackson Turner et al., good Roman Latin. That means and others. That will be Alfred Thayer Mahan and Charles Beard, an economist. Then I'll have one concluding slide to wrap it all up. So with that in mind, let's go on to a reminder of the people who go west. So the people who move west, again, I'm not trying to dumb it down or patronize you guys. There are true or external immigrants coming from Europe. I've talked about Scandinavians, Scots-Irish, Germans in through New Orleans, and the whole idea there is that it's not just New York. New York is certainly the main port of entry for most people, but they're also coming in through Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, Mobile, Alabama, New Orleans, and even Galveston, Texas. So there's lots of different ways that people are getting into America. We talked very briefly about the Chinese in the far west. Again, their pattern of migration is completely different. They're interested in coming to America, getting rich, and going back. And that will be critical later on. So if you don't have a good, strong notes on that, go back and watch it again. The second, major category of people moving to the west are American or internal migration. They're coming in from east of the Mississippi. They're displaced after the war, dissatisfied in the east. They're also driven by land rushes and gold rush after gold rush after silver rush, copper rushes. They want to escape. And itchy feet. There's just something over the hill that they want to see. So that is the two main groups of people that are going west, the two main categories. So with that in mind, let's slow up just a little bit and do a little image analysis. So let's start here in the upper left, that group of people there in front of those sod houses. From right to left is Jim Shores, his father, Jerry Shores, Jerry Shores' wife, Rachel, the Reverend Mark Shores, and his wife, Minerva, and infant, name unknown, Nebraska, 1887. I know that because the photographer very kindly wrote that on the back of the photograph. So there's a couple of things going on here. First, I want to talk very briefly about African Americans moving to the West. And this gets overlooked in most accounts. I'm not trying to suggest that all people that moved west were African Americans, or that most African Americans moved west. That's not true. Most African Americans, they're going to stay in the South well into the 20th century. We're not done with migrations, by the way. There are other internal migrations. But here, these individuals have picked up and moved west. And there's a propaganda myth that was very pervasive in the South at the time. And it's very racist. It's very denigrating of African Americans. And the idea was, and this was, the design purpose of the propaganda was to hold on to slaves in the first place. But the myth was that African Americans are, they're lazy, they don't work, they don't put forth any effort, and therefore that a white man has to supervise them. There's something wrong with their level of energy. They just hang around. And this is going to be a myth, a dynamic that goes well into the 20th century. This continuing myth that originates in the South before the Civil War, the antebellum period, that African Americans just, they're not like us. They don't work. They don't have any energy. But this slide gives lie to that. In other words, African Americans didn't really work well with slavery because they knew that their labor was not their own. I've talked about this. That is one of the definitions of slavery. You can be bought and sold, and your labor is not your own. But here, this family has moved out to the West. Again, a very arduous journey. We've talked about that, and we'll talk about that again in a moment. Then they built those fairly impressive structures in the background. These structures are made out of sod. We've seen that as a building material before. You go find the right patch of grass that, goes down deep, and you get a patch of it maybe about the size of a desktop, but only about 8 inches thick. Then you stack that up on top of each other like you would bricks, and the grass roots will hold onto the soil, and that's sod. And it's an inexpensive building material. It's free. If you can manage to cover it with limestone, it becomes adobe, and then it's virtually indestructible. So these are very impressive structures in the background. They started with nothing, think Homestead Act of 1862, and then they put those really impressive structures back there. And that took a lot of drive and a lot of energy, but of course in this particular case, this family is working for their own behalf. They're working for themselves. And so this gives lie to this idea, this propaganda that African Americans won't work or they're lazy or there's something wrong with them. That's not true. And it's really unfortunate that well into the 20th century, even into the 21st century, that will be a dynamic that African Americans have to overcome. So let's go clockwise here and go to these cowboys on the Rio Grande. Now, again, I'm not trying to suggest that all cowboys were black or that all black people that went to the West were all cowboys. That's not true. But I want you to think of cowboying as a profession, as a job. Not ranch handing, but cowboying. And it is hard, backbreaking, extremely dangerous work. And it doesn't pay really anything at all. So if you're African American and you're escaping the South and you head west, you need some kind of job, like right away. You need something productive to do. And going to one of these ranches and applying to be a cowboy, well, they're going to say yes. Not because these people are black, but because they're willing to put up with a lot of crap, which is true. And they'll take a job that doesn't pay very much, long hours. It's relatively dangerous, and it's just hard, backbreaking work. So it's well into the 20th century, and even into the 21st century, that we're just now uncovering how often, the rate of incidence, I suppose, that cowboys happen to be of African American descent. They're black. In other words, up until that, the mythology in America has been, all these cowboys, well, naturally, they're all white, and that's just not true. Let's go down to the two photographs at the bottom. And this, again, I've kind of alluded to this before. I've mentioned it before, but now we want to, kind of pick this apart a little bit. There's an old joke in the Army that U.S. Army stands for Uncle Sam ain't released me yet. And what that means is, it's a joke, obviously, but when you get into the Army, you're in for an enlistment, and they're not going to release you until they're basically done for you. And they're going to put a lot of pressure on you to re-enlist if they can. So during the Civil War, a lot of African Americans, almost 200,000 of them, joined the regular United States Army. This is a technical thing. They couldn't go into the state militia because they didn't belong, they didn't live in one of these northern states. So they couldn't be part of the state militia, let's say Ohio or Illinois or New York or whatever. So they had to join the regular United States Army. Well, when the war was over, the Army simply sent them west to deal with the Native Americans. And this provides a population group of African Americans in the West, and they're referred to as Buffalo Soldiers. And this is the 9th and 10th Cavalry. For a time when in my own military service, I was in D Troop 10th Cav, and they very much keep those Buffalo Soldier traditions alive. The 24th and 25th Infantry, you know, those regiments are still in the Army today, and they keep those Buffalo Soldier traditions alive. So when these soldiers did finally get mustered out of the Army, when they got, you know, released from the Army, they're going to stay in the West. They're going to write letters home saying, hey, you remember that cute little girl that lived over there? Send her out here because I'm going to make her my wife and we're going to live out here in the West. Because I have all these liberties, I have all these freedoms that I will never have if I go back to the South. An example of that is the National Park Service. They only recently discovered, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, not even, that the first park rangers, when Yosemite and Yellowstone, when they were first originated, the first park rangers are going to be black men. They're going to be African Americans. Because they were already out there, they knew how to stay alive on the prairie, they knew how to stay alive in that area, and they were going to work for really cheap. And then, you know, a few years went by, and all those African Americans were replaced by white park rangers, and so that part of their history got lost. And the Park Service is only just now rediscovering that. So for African Americans, and I have the phrase up there, for most of them, their motive to go to the West is going to be escape. They want to get the heck out of the South. They got to get the heck out of there. Going with the Army is one way, and just packing up and moving out is another. So let's continue to talk about pictures of, you know, continue on with image analysis of people that are going to the West. These upper two pictures here are Chinese immigrants on the railroad and a mine labor gang. And so, I don't know, I had a student do a report one time on image analysis, and they picked the picture there on the far left. And they said, see, these are African Americans in the West. And I kind of had to, you know, sorry, you should have, you know, talked to me about this. These are actually Chinese. And again, the Chinese are going to be very, very industrious. They come to America and they get trapped, and the easy gold and silver is gone. So they put on as labor gangs for the railroad, and they work really, really, really super hard. And it's very dangerous work. They're exploited terribly and maltreated. And so while it may look like they're African Americans, as it turns out, for those of you guys who don't know, I lived in China for a while, and Chinese people will tan really, really dark. And so this is a Chinese labor gang on the railroads. In that other upper image there, the second image towards the middle, they're working on a placer mine. We've seen this sort of thing in other pictures. And what I want you to draw your attention to here on both these images is this sort of tendency to self-segregate. Please write that down. The Chinese tend to self-segregate. They have their own habits, they have their own language, they have their own food preferences, and they tend to self-segregate. And so on the West Coast and later on the East Coast, we're going to get a Chinatown. And, you know, they may be larger or smaller. San Francisco's got an extensive one, so is Los Angeles. But this is another signal, another example of this self-segregation. And the reason why I want you guys to take a strong note here is later on when we talk about the Wong Kim Ark case, that's going to be an important factor, and I will draw this back to your attention. But under any circumstances, the Chinese are working really, really hard. There's lots and lots of them, and they're trying to make money with the idea of quite possibly going back to China. But again, they find themselves trapped here, and they put in businesses, and they stay in America. The last example that I want to talk about here is Hispanics, especially in the Southwest. That is to say California, New Mexico, a little bit in Arizona. What's important about this, ladies and gentlemen, is a different dynamic than all the immigrants. The Hispanics in the desert Southwest, they did not come to America. America came to them. For those of you guys who took History 1301, then you should know about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. And in that treaty, I've mentioned it several times before, America bought all those states out there, what will later on become New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. We pay Mexico a vast treasure of money for that. And the option for the people who were there, you could stay there and automatically you'd be American citizens. Or if you did not want to follow that route, you could pack up and move back to Mexico and you could retain your Mexican citizenship. Well, of course, most stayed. And we're talking around, I don't know, the numbers are kind of hard to get a hold of. Around 30,000 individuals, mostly around Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and modern-day San Diego, and modern-day Los Angeles. Los Angeles, for those of you guys who don't know, is a natural port, and it was a very small one at the time. And it's a really small port, and so is San Diego, because water, fresh water, is hard to get. But there was a significant Hispanic population in both those places. Now, these people are going to be maltreated later on, and many of the rights are going to be taken away, and they're going to live as second-class citizens for a long time. But under any circumstances, their pattern of migration was slightly different. They did not come to America. America came to them. One last little bit of image analysis. I think this next one's just kind of fun. Let's take a look at it. So for any of you who are listening to this and watching the presentation, you may have heard of a town nearby called Oklahoma City. And this, what you see here, that in its entirety was Oklahoma City in 1889. So 130 years from the time that I'm actually recording this, that was what Oklahoma City looked like 130 years ago. And Oklahoma City today, for those of you guys who don't know, it's a big city. Geographically, it's huge. It's one of the largest cities in America. Geographically, it's spread out. So if you're driving on I-35 and you head north to Oklahoma City, you run into what is Del City, and you go on north and keep going on I-35, and you get to the northern edge of Oklahoma City out there by the Hall of Fame. Well, that's, 25, 30-minute drive at highway speeds. And if you start in eastern Oklahoma City, out where all the medical complexes are, and then go by Tinker Air Force Base on I-40, and then come out on the west side of Oklahoma City, over by the airport, again, that's a 30-minute drive at highway speed. So it's a huge city. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know, maybe well over 1 million now. So when we look at Oklahoma City as it was in 1889, that's just an example of this huge exponential growth of the people heading west. It's just a really good visual example. Down below, again, this is an image that resonates with me. It may not resonate with you guys, but for those of you who just got out of high school, this is what a high school looked like in the 1880s. It's a one-room schoolhouse, again, made out of sod. The teacher is that young lady right there in the middle with the apron. And imagine the teaching skills that it would take to have all those young men and young women, along with, 12, 13-year-olds. You're going to have a whole bunch of 5 and 6-year-olds. And so that takes some teaching skills to keep them all occupied. Plus, there's, 30 of them there? And she's got to mind them all herself. Oh, man. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But this is what things were like in the West just a little over 100 years ago. So with all that in mind, let's transition and talk about how to get to the West. So, how to get to the West. In the time frame we're talking about, 1865 out to essentially the end of the century, 1900, there are only 3 mechanisms to do that: wagon, trains, and ship. And we will talk about it in that order. There's only 3 ways to get to the West: by wagon, by train, or by ship. And so just really quick, let's take a look at that wagon train. Now, that is not gotten up for a movie. That's what a wagon train looked like back in the day. In other words, that photograph was almost certainly taken at the very end of the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s. And so, strong note here, up until the turn of the century, really, most people that traveled to the West, all the way from the end of the Civil War, all the way to the year 1900, most people actually went by wagon. I'm sure you guys are not interested in my personal stories, but as a young man, when I was really, really young, I met my Aunt Annie, and that was my mother's aunt. And so she did this as a little girl, 10, 12, 14 years old. That's how she got out to the Oregon country. And I met her. She was older by then, and I was really, really young. But I personally have met somebody who did that thing. They had a wagon, they had a horse team, they had a milk cow tied to the back of the wagon, and that's how they got to the West. That's how they got out to the Oregon country. They saw Native Americans out there on the prairie. And so we're just that close to the event that I personally met somebody who did this. So when we're talking about wagons, most people, by far, for reasons that are going to become obvious in a minute, are going to go by wagon. We'll transition then and talk about trains. And for those of you guys who are taking a look at the image there, yeah, that I always make a little joke. Sometimes I get a laugh, sometimes I don't. That's like my love life right there. It's a train wreck. And so we'll talk about the pros and cons of trains, and there's a lot of cons, there's a lot of negatives. Last, we will talk about ships, and then we'll transition and talk, and we'll tie this up with a couple of slides talking about some people that are important going forward, and a concluding slide. So let's move forward. What we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is obviously a map. So let's kind of pick this apart. Going west by wagon, there are two major routes that you can take. Most by far went by the Oregon Trail. You leave Independence, Missouri, it's kind of that northern red trail there. You get over to the Platte River, you follow it into Wyoming as far as you can. Then you get into the Wyoming Badlands, that's sort of, western Wyoming. And then you can see that the trails kind of split up. Well, you've got to get through the mountains. You've got to negotiate a lot of mountains up there, the Rocky Mountains. Then just on the other side of Fort Hall there, you have a place that you can visit today if you're ever out in that part of the country. And the wagon ruts are still there. All the wagon ruts, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wagons that went out there left, a rutted pathway. And you can see that very, Y formation there, where the California Trail, some would go on down to the California gold fields, and others would head sort of northwest into Washington and into Oregon to go to the Willamette Valley. And so that's that formation there, that sort of Y shape, that's called the Parting of the Ways. And it's like a historic monument now, but you can go out there and you can walk that. So the other major trail is sort of more the Santa Fe Trail. And you leave Independence, Missouri, you go through Kansas, you try to get along the Arkansas River as far as you can go. Then you go down to the Red River at Santa Fe, and then, up into Utah, and kind of down some of these tributaries to the Colorado River, and wind up once again in California. You could split, I guess, right there just north of Los Angeles. That would be a very difficult route because you're out in the desert Southwest, and then finally you'll get into the Imperial Valley. Finally, on the very far south, you've got the Desert Trail. And the best thing about that, of course, is that it's very, very flat. You're outflanking the Rocky Mountains to the south. And so that is, desirable in a sense. But, of course, there's no water and there's no food. So it has a negative. There is a downside. Continue on with strong notes here. The distance between Independence, Missouri and the West Coast is about 12 to 1,500 miles. It depends on how many ups and downs and left and rights that you have to go to get that. Somewhere around 1,500 miles. And that's a long, long ways to go. But more importantly, and again, this gets lost in most descriptions of Western migration by wagon, Strong note here, people had to start in Ohio or Indiana or Illinois and get to Independence, Missouri first. So they'd already traveled 6 or 7 or 800 miles just to get to Independence, Missouri. And then they've got to go another 1,200 miles to get out to the West Coast. So when we're talking about traveling by wagon, this is quite an adventure. This is going to be very, very arduous. Now, let's go on then with this map in mind, and don't forget the map. But let's go on and do some image analysis and take a look at the pros and the cons. So let's start with this image in the upper left. The pros, the positives. The first positive to go to the West by wagon, it is inexpensive because most people already had a wagon and a team. Strong note, the first positive, it is inexpensive to go by wagon because most people already had a wagon and a team. Second, continuing on with this theme, you can take all of your stuff. If you take a look at one of those wagons, they can carry probably about a ton, 2,000 pounds of material. And that's a little bit of furniture, a plow, a whole lot of tools, picks and shovels and saws and things of that nature, clothing, bedding. You can take quite a little bit of stuff and put it in that wagon, and they'll carry about a ton. They're very, very robust. Another positive is self-reliance. This is hard to quantify, but everybody that went to the West by wagon and wrote about it or talked about it, they were of the attitude that they could do it, that this was not outside of their skill sets. And they were really, really confident if there's anything that went wrong, they'd be able to fix it. And so self-confidence is going to be it's going to be a big driver. That's going to be a big positive. Now, the corollary to that, kind of the flip side of self-confidence and self-reliance, is number one, high personal effort. Enormous personal effort. To be clear, if you're an adult, you're going to have to walk it. If you're a child above the age of about 6, you have to walk it. As an adult or as a child, a more mature child, an adolescent, you're just dead weight for those animals to have to pull. So mom and dad, they got to walk, and they're going to tell those kids, you got to walk it. You got a lot of energy, run it off. And so all day long, they're on the move. Because the animals cannot be, they can't be burdened with having to pull people. They got to pull all the stuff. So you got to walk it. Another element of this is isolation. This is a negative. Isolation is a negative. If something really serious happened, let's say your animals all died, or your wagon suffered some sort of catastrophic, destructive event, then that's it. It's you got to put everything you can onto a backpack and just walk the rest of the way. You're not going to be able to go buy another wagon. The people who are there with you, they're not going to say, listen, I'll share some space with you. No. So isolation, if you get sick, there's no doctor. You can't dial 911. If you get sick, you're probably going to die. If you suffer a really serious injury, you're probably going to die. Another negative is Native American attack, which is the next slide over there on the upper right. Now, there is some overlap, you guys, between the time when wagon trains begin going to the West and the time when Native Americans are going to be put on the reservation. And I kind of mentioned this before. Wagon trains that were just passing through, the Native Americans were okay with that, as long as you didn't stay. But there's always going to be these cultural problems. The Native Americans would say, well, listen, you've got to signal to us, you're going through our area, you got to signal to us that you're our friends, that you're not the enemy. And the way you do that is you give us some kind of gift. Well, this is where you would have a cultural disconnect. The settlers, these people in the wagons, they would say, well, you're just wanting a handout. You're just begging, and I'm not going to have it. So, okay, you want a little present from me? Here it is. I got a couple of bullets in this gun. You can have those. Boom, boom. And then you've got, battle on your hands. So attacks, Native American attacks on wagon trains, fairly rare, but they did happen, and that could be a very serious negative. Now, if you're thinking for a moment, well, why didn't the cavalry come and save these guys like they do in the movies? Well, these cavalry posts, which are the pictures down at the bottom, especially if you'll take a look at the 4 photographs, the 3 that are in a row there, the photograph on the far left, that's Bensel Fort in Colorado. And that's just what it looks like. That's the entire post. Fort Richardson, which is not that far away. If you want to go visit one of these western forts, Fort Richardson is not that far away. It's over by Wichita Falls. And it's well preserved, and there's just nothing there. So there's not many soldiers. They have other things they have to do, and protecting wagon trains as they pass through is just not one of them. So if you get into one of these Native American attacks, well, attacks, it's going to be bad. They're going to chase off your horses, burn the wagons. It could be really, really bad. Last but not least, and strong note here, this is technical, make a strong note. One of the negatives, if you will, is timing. Timing is a problem. You've got to time it just exactly right. You cannot leave Independence, Missouri too soon because there's not any grass for your animals to eat. The grass is still dormant from the winter, and your animals can't eat that. So you've got to wait for the grass to get up and get greened up. It does every year unless you have a drought. It's unpredictable. On the other hand, you can't leave too late. Otherwise, you won't make it to the other end before the snows set in. So strong note, it takes about 100 days to get from Independence, Missouri out to the West Coast. You can't leave too soon. There's no grass for you or your animals. You can't do that. You can't leave too late. You'll be trapped in the mountains over the winter. Last but not least, you have to time this perfectly because your animals cannot pull the wagons every day, whether they're horses or oxen. They can't pull the wagons every day. You have to go for a day or two, maybe 3, and then you have to rest. And then you go for another day or 2, and then you rest. You go for a day. If you had a hard day on the trail, you got to rest for another day. And you have to keep track of exactly where you're at on this route without any meaningful maps. So you're pushing as hard as you can, but if you push too hard, your animals will die. So timing is critical. An example of bad timing, very briefly. Some of you probably already know about this, but it's the Donner Party, D-O-N-N-E-R, the Donner Party. The Donner Party got away a little bit late. It's a group of families, 15 or 20 wagons, however many there were, and they got away a little bit late from Independence, Missouri. Their guide, their scout that was taking them out west says, I know a shortcut. We'll take this, and that'll save us a little bit of time. And the shortcut turned into a bad decision. And so they got hung up. But as it turns out, just as they were coming out of the mountains, they're all the way in about, the area of Lake Tahoe out in California. They're just coming out of the mountains. But they got hit by a blizzard. Well, immediately, the animals, they've been pulling wagons for, 1,200 miles, 1,100 miles. Most of them died right away. The snow was 30, 40, 50 inches deep. The story goes that the Donner Party, they sent some people down to the next town, which, as it turns out, was only about 7 or 8 miles away. They were only that far away, but they were up in the Sierra Madres. So a couple of guys went down to the next town and said, hey, we got an emergency on our hands. We're stuck up there. The animals have frozen to death and died, and we're jammed up. And the people of the town said, okay, well, this does happen. We'll go help you. But we're snowed in as well. The blizzard hit us too. And so we're going to dig out first, and then we'll go up there and help your people. Okay, fine. So just about the time that the people got dug out in their town and started heading up into the mountains to help these poor individuals in the Donner Party, another blizzard hit. And somebody measured it, and the snow was over 100 inches deep. Well, the people in the Donner's Party that were trapped, they tunneled around and tried to find these dead animals and eat them. And that didn't really work out. They were just skin and bones. There was nothing left. And finally, they kind of turned to cannibalism. And that's how they stayed alive, many of them. Down in the town, when the second blizzard hit, they said, listen, it's over. Those guys didn't make it. They're dead. And we'll go up there in the spring and bring back the bodies and, get them buried up. Well, it came to pass that somebody else was able to get on top of the snow and make it down to the town and said, no, we're still alive. There's a bunch of us up there. So, wow, they charged up there out of the town to try to save them. And, yeah, they had these individuals, these survivors had turned to cannibalism to try to stay alive. So when we talk about timing, it's pretty much a negative. You've got to hit the gas. But if you hit the gas too hard, your animals will die, and that's it. It's over for you. So going by wagon, again, most people made it. Self-reliance is going to be a big motivator. It's inexpensive. You can take a lot of your stuff. But the negatives, wow, that's that's in the balance. So with that in mind, let's talk about railroads for a while. Let's transition and start talking about railroads and how do we get to the West via railroad. So let's take a look at the map here, and please kind of, I don't know, later on you may want to come back to the map. That's fine, because I'm going to be talking about the railroad routes. So if you look at the eastern half of the United States, going into the 1870s, 1860s, there's a tremendous network east of the Mississippi. Railroads have been around since the 1830s. It was a high technology. It's extremely useful. And the only meaningful way to travel any distance at any speed is to go by rail. You had to do it. So there's a huge, extensive network, and everybody's used to using railroads, and the engineering is all there. Continue on with strong notes. During the Civil War, Lincoln is going to try to incentivize the railroads to figure out a route to get to the West. And he does this by offering them land grants. Strong note here. Lincoln said to the railroads, he had a big meeting, and he said, listen, you guys find a route out to the West, and wherever the route is, that's called the right of way. The right of way, that's where the railroad tracks will actually be. Lincoln says, survey it out, find the route, establish the right of way, and I will give you 1 mile on either side of the track as a land grant. You'll get that for free. So we're talking about, 1,100 miles worth of railroad tracks, and you get 1 mile on either side of the track. That's several thousand square miles of land. Think this all the way through. Once the railroad goes through, they will have put an improvement upon the land. And so the land that they got for free, then they put an improvement on their railroad. They can resell that at huge profit. So this is a strong incentive for the railroads. This is something they can kind of borrow against to go ahead and put the railroad actually in. The next step was to establish the route. Okay, so the first idea was to go through the Northern Pacific. Go up through Minnesota, the Northern Dakotas, Montana, the Idaho Territory, and wind up in Washington State. The advantage to this is you have the two things that a steam locomotive needs. Fuel, in this case wood, and water. A steam locomotive needs water. Those are the two essentials. Wood for fire and water for steam. So that entire route is like pierced with all kinds of rivers, and there's huge, gigantic forests up there, so plenty of wood, plenty of water. So that was meaningful. That would help. The problem was that when you got out there to the West Coast, you were not where anybody wanted to go. That was not the destination that people wanted. Seattle and Everett and all up in there, none of that was developed. None of it was. Puget Sound was not developed at all. Portland was this tiny little village on the Columbia River. And so nobody wanted to go there. The Willamette Valley, well, sure, but you could get there by wagon just as easy. The other choice was to go by the Southern Pacific. And that was passing through kind of the Texas Panhandle, the southern part of New Mexico, Arizona, and then up into California. The advantage was that you're outflanking the mountains to the south. So it's relatively flat. I'm not trying to patronize you guys. I'm not trying to dumb it down. But remember that railroads, the wheels on the railroad locomotive are flat. They're smooth. And then the track is smooth. So railroads don't do good with going up and down hills. If you're carrying a weight, you're trying to drag a weight, and you hit a hill, hit an upward slope, the wheels will just spin out. If you get up to the top of a hill and you go down the other side and you need to put on the brakes, you'll just skid. And so that's, a flat route is really desirable. The problem, of course, is that there's no water down there for steam, and there's no wood down there to create steam by burning wood. So that was out. And that meant you had to go by the route called the Central Pacific. Now, it had some advantages, but man, there are a lot of disadvantages. In other words, you start there in Nebraska, and it's fairly flat, and you're going to go right on the Platte River. That was on a map earlier on. But when you get to western Wyoming, you hit the Rocky Mountains. You hit them hard. And so then the only way to keep going is to blow tunnels out. You got to blast tunnels through the mountains. You come out the other side of the mountain, and you got a valley. And so you have to build a bridge. So it's tunnel, bridge, tunnel, bridge, tunnel, bridge, tunnel, bridge. And it took forever to do that. The railroads will also start in California and start going east, heading east from San Francisco. Well, there, they immediately hit the mountains, the Sierra Madres and the Sierra Nevadas. And so for them, they're having to blow tunnels up and then blow tunnels out and then bridge valleys, tunnels and valleys, tunnels and valleys, and tunnels and bridges and tunnels and bridges. So this took years and years to do. Yes? So with that background in mind, again, railroads with the high technology of the day, it took years and years and years to incentivize the railroads and get the actual track through. With that, let's go on to railroads and then the pros and cons. So, strong note here, super strong note here. Big letters. I'm not big on dates, but glitter glue this, LED lighting. You may not have railroads until May 10th, 1869, which sounds like a multiple choice question to me later on. You can't have railroads going to the west until May 1869. The railroads starting on the west coast and heading east, and the railroads that were starting in Missouri and heading west met at Promontory Point, Utah, where they drove in a symbolic golden spike and finally had a single trackway, the Central Pacific, going out there, linking the west coast to the east coast. Now, I have a note down there, not a single Asian or African American in sight. Most of the labor gangs were made up of individuals who were willing to work hard in desperate situations for very little money. And these are African Americans, former slaves, and Asians coming from the West Coast. And it is known, commentators said, yeah, there were Chinese people there and there were African Americans there, but the photographers and all of the very important people that you see politely told them to get the hell out of the picture. So they were there, they're just not in the picture. And that's unfortunate. It's just, it's just this sort of an example of this racism that's going on. It's endemic. So with that in mind, let's talk about the pros and the cons. The pros and the cons. The positives, the pros, the positives. Number one, it did not take much time. It was really, really relatively fast. About 14 days from Missouri or maybe Chicago about 14 days to the West Coast. 10 to 14 days, something like that. Usually around 14 days. Maybe it'd be a little bit faster sometimes, maybe a little bit slower. But if you compare that to wagons, which took 100 days, this is really, really fast. Furthermore, low personal effort. All you did was, you got your ticket, and you got your ticket punched, and then you went out to the West. You sat in, a railroad car, and off you went. Somebody else did all the work. You're just watching the scenery go by. So I've traveled by rail a lot in my time. In Europe, everybody travels by rail, and I've even traveled by rail here in the United States. And it can be done. It's inexpensive today if you can actually find passenger cars. But, this was high tech back in the time. So low personal effort. Well, with that in mind, let's go. That's about it for the positives. The negatives are extensive. So if you're at the bottom of the page, get a new page. Now, the first argument is the economic argument. So strong note here. If you need to go back to the map, go back to the map. But please understand, ladies and gentlemen, it is a single track way. This is not a dual track way. That doesn't happen until the 20th century. So for 30 years there, it's a single track way to the west. I don't mean to suggest that a single train started in the east and went all the way to the west coast and then somehow turned around and came back. That's not what happened. Instead, ladies and gentlemen, there are multiple trains on the track at the same time going in opposite directions. There are multiple trains on the track at the same time going in opposite directions. Well, it doesn't take rocket science to figure this out. That could be a problem, a very serious problem. We call that a head-on collision. Now, these trains are not going to go very fast back in the day. These are locomotives from 1869. This picture was taken on the day of the Golden Spike. So they might bowl along at 25, 30 miles an hour. If you really give it everything they've got, they might get to 35, 40, but probably not. But imagine a head-on collision. For whatever reason, both sides didn't see the other guy, and you have a head-on collision going 30 miles an hour. That's like hitting a brick wall at 60 miles an hour. Your closing speed at 30 miles an hour each is 60 miles an hour to get to a dead stop. Well, there's no safety devices at all, so you're going to die. If the collision didn't kill you, remember these are steam locomotives. You're going to be boiled alive. There's going to be, roast you alive like a lobster. All that live steam is crazy. Continue on with strong notes. There's another technical problem. This is technical. Please listen to me carefully. There's no meaningful braking system. This is B-R-A-K-E, brakes. B-R-A-K-E, not the other brake, B-R-E-A-K. That's like you're going to go to lunch or something. B-R-A-K-E. So there's no braking system. On a locomotive, a steam locomotive back in those days, the way you stop the steam locomotive is you turned a series of valves and you threw the engine into reverse. That's how you stop the actual locomotive. Well, for those of you guys who have ridden a bicycle, let me ask you this. If you're riding a bicycle, a 10-speed or whatever, do you ever just throw on the front brakes to get stopped? Well, nobody ever does that because you're going to go over the handlebars. No different here. If you're bowling along at 25, 30 miles an hour, something happens, they got to throw the engine in reverse to try and get stopped. You're going to be in another train wreck. The cars are just going to pile up and derail, and you got a wreck on your hands. So the solution is to put brakes on all of the cars, all the little wagons that the locomotive is pulling. But they're not automatic. You have to have a guy out there, a brake man, who listens for the engine. And if something goes wrong, they blow a horn or they ring a bell or whatever, and that signals to the brakeman, go out there, turn a great big giant mechanical wheel, The wheel turns a bunch of shafts and gears, and then down on the actual wheels that contact the track, you'll have a brake down there. You'll have a braking system. The problem there is that the shoes were made out of wood. So you have these wooden shoes, brake shoes, going onto steel wheels to try and get the crazy thing stopped. And that's going to lead to a fire, or the brakemen are not going to react fast enough, and you got another train wreck on your hands. So it's very, very dangerous to go by rail. Continue on with the negatives. Again, there's only a single trackway. So the argument I gave you just now about the negative was technological. Now it's the economic argument. The economic argument, not economic argument. Because there's only a single trackway, supply, railroad travel to the west, is limited. You only have a single trackway. But demand is unlimited. And that means the price of a ticket is going to be enormous. Freight prices, for the same reason, limited supply and unlimited demand, freight prices are also sky high. That's where the railroads actually made all their money. They didn't want to take people, they wanted to take cargo. So you can't take much of your stuff. Freight prices are too high. Furthermore, as a passenger, you can't stay on the train overnight. The trains didn't travel at night. They didn't have meaningful headlights. So you've got to put up in a town. Well, the town, the hotels and saloons in town, their only source of real income is providing rooms for railroad passengers. So you're going to get gouged. They're going to stick it to you. So traveling to the west by rail is extremely expensive. It's you and your family, quite possibly, and a bag of money. That's how you travel by rail to the west. You've got to have enough money to start all over again in the west. There's no manufacturing in the west, so you got to buy all new stuff when you get out there. And all that stuff then, in turn, had to come from the East Coast. So it's hideously expensive to travel the west by rail. Technologically, it's dangerous. Yes? So when we talk about the negatives, again, you take one of these railroad trips out to the west, you might well be taking your life in your own hands. Furthermore, later on, gangsters are going to know, criminals are going to know, that the people on the train are, they're fairly well off. So guys like Frank and Jesse James, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, they're going to start doing railroad robberies because they're really, really lucrative. So even if you made it, you're going to have a story to tell because you got robbed at gunpoint. So on analysis then, think this all the way through, traveling the west by rail, it's got some pros, but you know what? Going by wagon's starting to look better and better all the time. Last but not least, certainly, let's go by ship. Let's go to the west by ship. Now, when we're going to the west by ship, ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear. These are ships, not boats. These are not boats. They are ships. Boats are those little white, boats in the foreground that you kind of see there. That's a boat. But the vessels that you see tied up at the dock there, those are ships. Now, really briefly on this is not a class on hydrodynamics, but what I'm about to tell you is important for our era. There had been two shipbuilders who had come up with a new shipbuilding technology, and that's William Webb and Donald Mackay. And Donald Mackay and William Webb, they looked at ship design. They said, listen, let's think about this for a minute. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, you're looking down on the bow of one of these ships, the very front end of the ship, the bow. And since time immemorial, going back to Egyptian times, Phoenician times, before the time of Christ, the bow of a ship had always been a teardrop shape. And this allows the water to flow around the bow of the ship. They'd always been built that way. But all the way in the 1850s now, 1840s and 1850s, William Webb and Donald Mackay said, you know what? No, let's think this all the way through. Instead of having it a teardrop shape, Let's build it so it's, instead of being concave, let's build it so it's convex. And that means that the front of the boat, the front of the bow, is a knife shape, not a teardrop shape. Instead of flowing through the water, we're going to start cutting through the water. And these sorts of ships are called clipper ships. CLIPPERS, clipper ships. They're designed in such a way that they cut through the water, and they're designed for speed. These are large, large ships. If you look kind of at the right side of the slide, you'll see those three masts with all the yards going, kind of east and west of the mast going straight up. Well, the stern of the ship is almost in the geographic center of the slide over there. You can see that white railing going around the stern of the ship. And the bow of the ship is off the picture to the left. So these are large vessels, 200-300 feet long, 40-50 feet wide, 25-30 feet down to the bottom of the hull. So let's start then with the pros and the cons. The pros. Well, I tell you what, let's go to the next slide, and I think I'll be able to cover that a little bit better. Let's start then with the pros and the cons. The pros. There's a whole lot of these clipper ships. That's why we're on this slide. Take a look at that picture there on the left. That's actually, it's not just a generic picture. It's actually a very famous picture, a very important picture of the ship whose bow you see there in the foreground. That very first ship that you see there, that's Sea Witch. And guys like me who study this sort of thing, we know that because the figurehead was very famous for Sea Witch, and it was a dragon. You can see the bottom body of the dragon. It looks like a crocodile, but then you can also kind of make out the wings there on the front of the ship, on the bow. And so Sea Witch was an extremely famous ship for the time. Very, very fast. Very reliable. But take a look at the background there. Look at that sea, that forest of masts and all the yardarms. So these are ships on the East Coast getting loaded up. Look at all the barrels and the wagons. They're loading these ships up so they can get out to the West with a lot of cargo. The other two photographs that you see on the right, that is San Francisco Harbor in about 1855. That's what it says in the photograph. And so that's all these sailing ships, this huge number of sailing ships that got to the West Coast. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Great Republic, Storm King, Sea Witch, Flying Cloud. These are very, very famous ships at the time. Comet, Rainbow. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. So in this particular case, many of the ships got to the West Coast and then were promptly abandoned by their crews who went out to the gold fields. They were going to hit it rich, which meant that you had to build a whole lot more ships on the East Coast, and then they were built strictly for the California trade, going back and forth to California. So lots and lots and lots of ships. So the pros. The pros are there's a lot of ships, and that means competition for cargo and passengers drove prices down. Please write that down. There's a great many ships going out from the East Coast to the West. And competition between the ships for cargo and passengers drove freight prices and ticket prices down. Because there's so many ships moving out there, you get to take all of your stuff. Cargo prices were very, very low. They're very, very reasonable. So many an entrepreneur said, okay, I'm going to go out there to the gold fields. I want to go to the West Coast. I'll take all sorts of manufactured goods with me. Sell that stuff on the West Coast, and I'll have a little bit of a nest egg. I'll have a little bit of startup money. So they load up wagons that are broken down, harness, equipment. You can't take a lot of livestock because livestock doesn't want to travel by sea that well. But you can take all sorts of dry goods, out there to the West Coast, hammers and, machine goods and saws and picks, all the stuff that people need. Load that up onto the ship. That's your stuff. It gets out to the West, and you can sell it and make a lot of money. So it's inexpensive. You can take a lot of stuff. The third positive, the third pro, Low personal effort. It seems so obvious, but I have to say it. The sailors will do the sailing. Once you're on the ship, you go down below. There are accommodations on the deck, but like that actually took a lot of money. Most passengers that are going to the west, they go down below into the hold of the ship, and that's where they stay. So that then leads us to some of the negatives. And for some of the negatives, let's go to the next slide. So I have it on there. It's a little bit of a joke. We're going to put these down as negatives. One of the negatives is shipwrecks. And that's kind of what you're seeing there. That picture down at the bottom, that's a shipwreck. So if you were a passenger on board that ship, you did not make it to the West Coast. You got shipwrecked. Hopefully you lived. It appears to me that the people that were on that ship had a very rough ride, but then maybe they got ashore. They lived. That picture that you see on the upper right, what happened there is the ship has been dismasted. Now, I want you guys to think that all the way through. The ship was under tremendous stress because they were clearly in a storm. And then the upper mast, on the main mast, the middle mast there, and the mizzen mast, the mast kind of on the far right, the upper mast of those broke off. Now, this is like a telephone pole 200 feet up in the sky. They broke off, and then they fell down, and that upset and tangled up the rigging all the way down. So you're in a really, really bad way, and then the mast breaks and wrecks up all the rigging. You could easily lose the ship. So coupled with that negative, shipwrecks, you could drown. There's not much way of coming back from drowning. But by far and away, most ships made it. Remember that the route, and that's why I have the map up there, you're having to go all the way from the East Coast around South America. The Panama Canal has not been put through yet, and then all the way up to San Francisco. So going by ship, about 100 days. The record was actually for Sea Witch, that ship that you saw on that earlier slide. She made it in 89 days, 13 hours. It's a record. Flying Cloud made it in well under 100 days, 90 days, 95 days. That's pretty much an average. But occasionally, of course, you get into bad seas or you get into a bad way, and it could be a little bit longer, 103 days, 110 days. If you didn't get into a damn shipwreck, which is going to hold you up, I don't know, forever. But by far and away, most ships made it. Strong note now, if you lived on the East Coast, going by ship is really your only choice. So the pros, inexpensive. Take all your stuff. Low personal effort. The negatives, you could drown. You could get into a shipwreck. But by far and away, most ships made it. Seasickness is always going to be a problem, all right? I've been on the seas before in big ships where we were in a storm. We tried to cross the English Channel one time. Huge storm. Now, I don't personally suffer from seasickness. I was having a great time. It was like a roller coaster ride. But I looked around at some of the other people, and they were puking bad. So seasickness is going to have a very negative effect on you for the first, 10 or 12 days out to sea, and then you'll kind of get over it. But if you suffer from seasickness, there's no way around it. There's not enough Dramamine, which hadn't been invented yet. There's not enough Dramamine in the world to save you. Okay? Seasickness, shipwrecks, drowning, those are the negatives. Under any circumstances, by about 1890, the West can be said to be populated. Now, there will be other migrations, and many of them will continue to head out west. We're not done with western migration entirely. We're just done with that first wave. So, with that in mind, let's go on to the next slide. We need to talk about some personalities. There are three individuals that we need to discuss here. Frederick Jackson Turner, again, then Alfred Thayer Mahan, and then Charles Beard. Frederick Jackson Turner. That's his picture right there. That's him. Again, he's a college professor, Princeton, I think, maybe Yale. Doesn't matter. He wrote the Frontier Thesis, and in it he postulated that western migration was a major event in American history. He says that the frontier is where wilderness meets civilization. He says that the frontier closed in 1890. He uses the U.S. Census to determine that. It's an artificial end. And so the frontier thesis, again, I can't overemphasize that. That's what, in other words, what Frederick Jackson Turner did was put this into an academic setting where we could pick it apart, which is what I just got finished doing. We used history as a scientific process to discover what Western migration was really all about. We just did that. So Frederick Jackson Turner, very influential, and he was right. The next individual there, strong notes here. Now, Alfred Thayer Mahan is going to be important going forward. I'm setting the groundwork for progressivism and American imperialism here. Alfred Thayer Mahan is going to be important going forward. A little bit of a biography on Alfred Thayer Mahan. So, as a young man, 12, 14 years old, he decided he was going to go to sea. He was going to be a sailor in the Navy. He joins the Navy as a midshipman. And this is in the 1830s, 1840, when all ships were made of wood, and the only motive power was sail. Wooden ships driven by sail. And so as a very young man, that's how you did it back in those days, the idea was you learned the ropes. That's where that phrase comes from. You know, you go to a new job site, well, let me show you the ropes. And that you learn then how to get through your job site, what's important and what's not important. So that phrase comes from learning how to actually sail one of these big giant warships. The Civil War came along. Alfred Thayer Mahan was involved in the Civil War in the Union Navy, the United States Navy. He was in a couple of battles. Battle of Mobile Bay. He was up and down the Mississippi River. So he was very active in the Navy at the time. The Navy was going through a transition during the Civil War. You used a steam engine, which were very inefficient at the time, a steam engine with a screw propeller, and that's how you got into and out of a port. That's the most dangerous time of being in a sailing ship, trying to maneuver in and out of a port. Well, a steam engine, you could do that. But then you turn the engine off and hoisted up the sails and then just use the wind because it's very inefficient. I'm sorry, it's very inexpensive and it's very efficient. So that Civil War period, which he personally witnessed, that was a transitional time for the Navy. At the very end of his career in the 1880s, all ships in the Navy were iron or steel hulled. There's no more sailing ships at all. All the ships had big, giant, efficient steam engines and big, giant guns with huge steel hulls, a ship that you would recognize today. And so from a young man to an old man, he witnessed this truly revolutionary change in naval architecture. He was in the Navy at a very important time. So let me finish up with a bio of Alfred Thayer Mahan. At the very end of his career, he was the commandant at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And he was the commanding officer of the Naval Academy there. And while he was the commanding officer there, he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. Now, this was a tremendously influential book. That's what's so important here. For those of you guys who don't know, between 1660 and 1783, the Navy that became the most important Navy was the British Navy, the Royal Navy. That very weak beginnings to 1660, but by 1783, they were a powerful, powerful Navy. And so Alfred Thayer Mahan writes the history of that, the influence of sea power upon history, 1660 to 1783. Strong note now, here's his thesis statement. Alfred Thayer Mahan pointed out that England was a tiny little country with limited resources. But they poured their resources into a very powerful navy. Therefore, their navy could go anywhere on planet Earth that they wanted to go and do anything they wanted to do once they got there. In other words, if the Navy, the British Navy, wanted to go to India or China and blow the crap out of somebody, well, they could do that. Up anchor, hoist sails, off you go. 8, 9 months later, you're out in the Pacific somewhere blowing the crap out of somebody. If you wanted merchant ships to go out there and do peaceful trade, they could do that as well because the Royal Navy was there to protect them. So this made England, a tiny little country, influential all over the world. That's what he's driving at. England, a tiny little country with limited resources, poured all their resources into a strong navy. Therefore, England became really influential all over planet Earth, which is true. That's exactly what happened. Continue on with strong notes. Really strong notes here. Really strong notes here. Alfred Thayer Mahan went on to imply if America wants to be important in the 20th century, remember he's writing this in the 1890s, 1880s. So in the next century, the 20th century, if America wants to be important in that time, they need to build a big, giant navy. And everybody read this book. Theodore Roosevelt read it. Grover Cleveland read it. All the admirals read it. Lots of people in Congress read it. And they said, you know what? Alfred Thayer Mahan is right. And so moving forward in the 1880s, 1890s, 19-teens, and on forward, we're going to have a big, gigantic, powerful navy. A quick example. Going into World War II, I think we only had 8 aircraft carriers. What was it? Ranger, Langley, Enterprise, Saratoga, Yorktown, Lexington, I think a couple of others. And so that's what we had going into World War II. 7 or 8 aircraft carriers, well, not very many, of which Ranger and Langley, they were like really, really old. They were on their way out. They were just used for training. At the end of World War II, 4 years later, we had 103, of which several of those in the meantime had been sunk. So we had 103. Today, we have more aircraft carriers than all the other nations on planet Earth combined. If there's a problem anywhere on planet Earth, the first words out of the president's mouth are, or should be, where's the nearest aircraft carrier? Because then we could project power to that area because we have aircraft carriers, because we're important at sea. So Alfred Thayer Mahan was right, and this was influential, and the United States is going to build a gigantic navy, and we have it even today. That makes us number one. I'm telling you right now, that's one of the reasons why we're number one. Last but not least, let's talk about Charles Beard. Now, Charles Beard is a little bit anachronistic. Anachronistic. That's a highfalutin college word that you need to know. Anachronistic means he's out of our time. Charles Beard was writing in the 1920s. He's an economist, and he wrote a book called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States of America. Strong note now. In writing his book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States of America, he's looking back at the period of time that we're about to go through. That's what makes him important here. You need to know about Charles Beard because he's writing about the time that we're about to go through, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, on an economic and sociological level. That will be progressivism. And Charles Beard has a simple thesis statement. The Constitution can be interpreted as an economic document. We think of the Constitution in broad terms as maybe a sociological document. You know, it gives people rights. You have the right to free assembly. You have the right to free speech. You have the right to petition your government. It frees the slaves, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. It identifies who's citizens and who are not. It identifies different people getting the vote. And so it's also a political document. It gives us checks and balances. It outlines that we have a Congress, we have a legislation, we have an executive, and we have a judiciary. And that's very political. It outlines the powers of each, what they can and cannot do. But Charles Beard had a new interpretation of the Constitution, and this was earth-shattering. He took a long, hard look at it as an economist. He said, listen, the Constitution was written by the rich, wealthy elite, which is true, Hamilton and Madison. They were really, really rich. The Constitution was written by the rich, wealthy elite to protect the interest of the rich, wealthy, and elite. And ladies and gentlemen, there's something to that. Nobody ever thought about that before. Nobody ever conceived of the Constitution being an economic document. And the first piece of evidence that Charles Beard gives in support of his thesis is, gee, I don't know, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. America is not any species of utopia. It is very capitalistic in its economic underpinnings, and the Constitution supports that. And so the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that is an economic reality. That's an economic interpretation. Now, he probably goes a little bit too far in saying that it perpetuates the rich getting rich and then staying rich, and the poor getting poor and staying poor. You can rise to the level of your capabilities. But he is looking back at the region, at the era of time that we're about to start going through. So as we move forward, don't forget about Charles Beard. I will talk about him later on. As an economist, I'm not really a fan of Charles Beard. He kind of talks about trickle down. I'm a John Maynard Keynes guy, but we will talk about that later on. Let's move on to the final slide in Western migration. In summation, then, the results of Western migration. Our thesis statement was Western migration was a major event in American history, and I think I've pretty much proven that. The results: Native Americans are decimated and forced onto the reservation. We've talked about that extensively. Think of the Dawes Severalty Act. Think of all these various wars. Vastly increased national wealth based on the discovery and exploitation of precious metals. We've talked about that. There's gold rush after gold rush, silver rush after silver rush. Greatly expanded agricultural influence in the economy. Grain crops, cattle, low-cost land. We've talked about all that. The virtual extinction of the buffalo and other wildlife. That's big in your book. We didn't talk about that a whole lot, but that's what's going to happen. Moving forward, there's going to be a basis for a political shift from north versus south, which is the way it had always been in America since the 1700s, to east versus west. The West Coast is going to say, look, we're providing all sorts of things are going on here, and we want to stay in government. And that will be important moving forward. Frederick Jackson Turner insists that the end of the frontier is a landmark event in American history, and he was right. I hope you all agree with that. So thank you very much for being patient with me. We've gone through Western migration. I've had it divided up into 3 separate parts, and that's just kind of the nature of it. Thank you very much, and I will see you guys in 1302 in progressivism, and I will see you in class.